more than 90% of the damage that we see across Puna in terms of tree fall came from non-native trees. And 90+% of those non-native trees, or those are introduced trees, were Albizia trees. But there were substantial numbers of ironwood trees, casuarina, that came down, and they also caused quite a bit of damage. Eucalyptus was a tree of note that we saw that came down in certain places. But by and large, Albizia was the tree that caused the most damage by a long shot. If those trees were not here, and instead we had ohia trees, we would not have seen a fraction of the damage that we saw. The ohia trees, the ohia stands that still exist across a lot of the landscapes in Puna, they were fine. They withstood the storm just fine. And so, unfortunately, we replaced those relatively non-hazardous ohia forests with very hazardous non-native trees. My name is Flint Hughes, and I'm a research scientist with the U.S. Forest Service here at the Institute of Pacific Islands Forestry in Hilo. Started working on answering questions about Albizia probably 10, 12 years ago now. And our main interest initially was about the impact that Albizia was having as it invaded into native ohia forests in Puna. So we did a lot of initial work looking at and understanding its impacts and how it displaced the native trees and changed nutrient dynamics as being a nitrogen fixer, and brought in other non-native species that would not be able to survive and persist and really flourish without the presence of Albizia. So we worked on that initially, and then we started to get more involved just because of public interest and concerns about the threats posed by Albizia. We started getting more involved in control measures and how to think about Albizia as part of our kind of human landscape, human and natural forest landscape across Puna and other parts of Hawaii Island. Its namesake is the Molucca Islands, which is one of the places it's native to. So that's Indonesia and the far western Pacific. The Molucca Islands are part of that archipelago up above Java, I believe. But it gets as far into it gets as far east in the Pacific as the Solomon Islands. It's prevalent across many of the other Pacific islands, though, as an introduced species. American Samoa, Palau, Pohnpei, Yap, Fiji, Tonga. It's pretty much present across the majority. It's very invasive here, and part of that is a function of our native vegetation and our geology. We have a lot of areas that are nitrogen, a lot of landscapes where nitrogen in the soil is very limiting, and so because Albizia is a nitrogen fixer, it has a strong competitive advantage over other species that it's growing with. So it can grow much faster than many of our native species, and it certainly does do that. And that's primarily by virtue of its nitrogen fixing capacity. And then it's just innate growth rates. I mean, there are plenty of species that fix nitrogen, but this tree in particular happens to be among the fastest growing trees in the world. Well, one thing we've seen from trees that have toppled over in the past and currently, we see that their root architecture tends to lack any kind of a taproot going down deep into the soil or into the rock. When you see an Albizia tree toppled over, you see this kind of planar root system where the roots are all lateral, going out from the bottom and really not getting into the soil or the rocks to any depth. So it really doesn't have a good anchor. It's kind of almost just the root system sitting on top of the surface of the rocks. The trees are exposed to high winds, those roots really don't have the capacity to keep it in place. More recent years, we've come up with good techniques to kill Albizia. Dr. James Leary over at CTAR, University of Hawaii Manoa, CTAR, he has developed an excellent technique to kill Albizia quickly, effectively, and quite cheaply, using a herbicide called Milestone that's highly effective on Albizia. You can go in and kill large individuals quite quickly, hundreds in a day easily, and so it makes that kind of control tractable across landscapes. trees that are growing along roadsides, or along power lines, or homes, we really need to be much more careful about how we kill and or remove those trees, because we don't want to kill a tree and leave it as a dead snag that's going to pose a threat. Those trees, in contrast to the non-hazard trees, which can be killed quite cheaply at about $2 a tree, those more hazardous trees have to be thoughtfully assessed, and they need to be trimmed or brought down by certified arborists in most cases. And so that's an expensive proposition. We've killed thousands of trees across the Puna landscape before the storm. What we noticed that the trees that we had killed and that had been dead for months, they were standing after the storm, whereas many of the living trees that were living prior to Islle had toppled over. And so that kind of makes sense, because when you kill Albizia with the milestone treatment, the first thing you see is that the leaves fall off the tree. And so once that happens, the trees are really just the skeleton of the tree, and they lack that leaf area that really, from what we've come to understand and see, really acts as a sail in these high storm events, really catching the wind and eventually pushing the tree over if the winds are high enough. That's really a positive outcome of some of our management efforts. What we've learned about Albizia, first off, is that the seeds and the seedlings and the saplings of Albizia are very shade sensitive, so that if any kind of vegetation, anything is growing over them, they won't germinate and they won't grow. And so it's very important when we're thinking about kind of the post, the response that we take in clearing and controlling Albizia, is that when we're killing or cutting Albizia, that we really need to do as good a job as possible of keeping that existing vegetation intact underneath Albizia, because that's really going to keep the seedlings from coming up out of the ground. Yeah.